I never told my son-in-law there was a second set of books. That was the thing he never figured out. He spent 8 months trying to get close to me, 8 months smiling across my kitchen table, 8 months asking careful questions about the clock shop, how much foot traffic, what the lease looked like, whether I'd ever thought about selling. And the whole time, he had no idea that the real numbers were sitting in a fireproof lockbox behind the false wall in my workshop, 3 feet below where he once leaned against the doorframe and said, "This is a great space, Arthur. You ever think about what this property's worth per square foot?" I thought about that question for a long time afterward. My daughter's name is Claire. She was 31 when she brought him home. His name was Todd, and he had the kind of handshake that's too firm on purpose, the kind that's practicing something. He sold something in finance. I never fully understood what, and I don't think that was an accident. He had a good-looking face and an easy laugh, and within 20 minutes of meeting me, he'd complimented my workbench, asked about my late wife, and mentioned twice, casually, that Claire had told him what a successful business I'd built. My wife Margaret had been gone 4 years by then. Claire knew that was still a raw place for me. I want to be fair here. I don't think Claire started out with bad intentions. I think she loved Todd, or thought she did, or needed to believe she did. And I think Todd was very good at making people feel chosen. He had a way of giving you his full attention that felt like a gift, until you realized he only turned it on when he wanted something. I noticed things. That's what I do. I've been repairing clocks for 38 years. You learn to notice things when your whole livelihood depends on finding the one gear that's slightly off, the one spring that's wound a half-turn too tight. You develop an eye for what's not working the way it's supposed to. The first thing I noticed was that Todd never asked about the clocks themselves. He asked about the building, the location, the clientele, the margins. But never once did he pick up a movement and ask how it worked. Margaret used to say that you could learn everything about a person by what they were curious about. Todd was curious about value. Not the kind of value that takes decades to understand. The kind with a dollar sign in front of it. The second thing I noticed was a Sunday afternoon in October, maybe 3 months after I'd met him. Claire and Todd had come over for lunch, and afterward Claire went to lie down. She'd had a headache, and Todd offered to help me clean up. We were standing at the kitchen sink, and he said, very naturally, like it had just occurred to him, "You know, my buddy does estate planning. Really good guy. Totally confidential. Might be worth a conversation, just to make sure everything's set up the right way." I said I had a lawyer I was happy with. He nodded. Said, sure, absolutely. And then he started asking about whether the business was incorporated, whether the property was in my name or in a trust, whether Claire was listed as beneficiary on my retirement accounts. I washed the same plate twice and didn't answer most of it. That night I called my lawyer, a woman named Grace, who'd handled Margaret's estate and who had known me for 20 years. I told her about the conversation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Arthur, you might want to put a few things in order." Not because she thought I was in danger, but because she's practical, and she'd seen enough families come apart over money to know that clarity now saves grief later. We spent 2 weeks going through everything: the shop, the property, the retirement accounts, the insurance policies. Grace put together a trust structure that made sense, updated my will, and gave me a copy of everything in a sealed envelope that I brought home and put in the lockbox behind the false wall. Margaret had helped me build that workshop the year we got married. The false wall was her idea. She'd grown up poor and never fully trusted banks, and we'd compromised on a fireproof lockbox as the sophisticated version of money under the mattress. After she passed, I kept using it. Old habits. I didn't tell Claire about any of this. I didn't tell her because I wanted to see what happened next. What happened next was that Todd started coming by the shop. Not often enough to seem suspicious. Once a week, sometimes less. He'd bring coffee and sit on the stool by the counter and watch me work and make conversation. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a son-in-law getting to know his father-in-law, and maybe that's what he told himself it was. But the questions kept coming. Slow and patient and always at an angle, never direct. Have you thought about retiring? What would you even do with a property like this if you sold? Do you have a property manager, or do you handle the building yourself? I saw a place 2 blocks over sold for almost $1 million too. Did you know that? I knew that. I also started writing things down. Not because I was certain yet, but because Margaret always said that if something feels wrong 3 times, it isn't a coincidence anymore. It felt wrong more than 3 times. In February, I hired a private investigator. His name was Carl, and he was retired law enforcement, methodical and quiet, and completely without drama, which was exactly what I needed. I told him I wanted to know about Todd's finances, his background, whether there were other people in the picture, and whether my daughter knew what her husband was actually doing with his days. Carl came back to me 6 weeks later with a folder I didn't want to open. Todd had significant debt. Not the kind that happens to careful people during hard times. The kind that accumulates when someone is consistently spending more than they have and expecting a correction that never comes. There were 2 investment accounts that had been liquidated in the past 18 months. There was a lien on the car he drove, which Claire probably thought was paid off. There was a woman in Scottsdale he'd been in contact with for at least a year. And there was a conversation. Carl had documented it through surveillance, where Todd met a man at a bar in the suburbs and spent 40 minutes talking. Carl had gotten close enough to catch pieces of it. The other man apparently had some background in real estate transactions. The phrases Carl wrote down were change of ownership, quick close, power of attorney, and at one point, apparently the old man's not going to be a problem. I sat with that folder for 3 days before I did anything. Part of me wanted to call Claire immediately. But I'd learned enough about Todd by then to know that if I went to her without airtight proof, he would find a way to reframe it. He was good at that. He would make it about me being controlling, or paranoid, or unable to accept that my daughter had her own life. And Claire loved him, or needed to, and she might choose to believe him, and then I'd lose them both. So I kept watching. In March, something changed in Claire's behavior. She started calling me more often, which should have been good but felt careful, like she was checking on something. She asked twice in 1 week whether I'd updated my will recently. She mentioned that Todd had a friend who could recommend a good financial planner, someone who specialized in generational wealth transfer. She said those words exactly, generational wealth transfer, and they sounded borrowed. I told her I was all set. Then one Thursday evening in April. I remember it was a Thursday because I closed the shop early on Thursdays, and I was already home. I got a call from my assistant Kevin. He was 19, worked Tuesdays and Thursdays, good kid who paid attention. He said he'd forgotten his jacket and come back to the shop and found the back door unlocked. He said there was a car he didn't recognize parked in the alley, and he could see light moving around in my workshop through the gap at the bottom of the door. He said, "Should I call the police?" I said, "Give me 10 minutes. Then yes. I live 8 minutes from the shop. I parked 2 streets over and came in through the front with my key, quiet as I've ever moved in my life. The workshop is at the back of the building, past the service counter and the display cases. The door was closed but not latched. I could hear 2 voices. One was Todd. The other was a man I didn't recognize. I pushed the door open. Todd was at my main workbench. He had the drawers open. He was wearing gloves, which told me this wasn't impulsive, this was planned. The other man was standing near the shelves with a small flashlight, running it along the wall. Todd saw me first. For a moment, nobody said anything. I've thought about his face in that moment many times since. There was surprise, obviously, but underneath it there was something else, a kind of recalculation happening in real time. And I recognized it because I'd seen it before. It was the same face he made when I deflected one of his questions about the property. Already figuring out the new angle. He said, "Arthur, I can explain." I said, "I know you can. I'm not interested." And I took out my phone and called the police. The other man left fast. I let him go. I had what I needed on Todd. The police came. Todd was arrested for breaking and entering. His lawyer got him out by morning, which I expected. These things take time to work through the system, and I had no illusions about how long it would take or what the outcome would be. But the arrest was on record, and Carl had his documentation, and Grace had everything she needed. What I hadn't planned for was Claire. She called me at 7 in the morning, before I'd slept. Her voice was not the voice of someone who had just found out her husband had broken into her father's shop. It was the voice of someone who was trying to hold two things together at once, something that she knew and something that she'd been telling herself wasn't true. She said, "Dad, what happened?" Not a question, a statement almost. I said, "I think you need to come over." And I said, "I think you already know some of this." She came. She sat at my kitchen table in the same chair she'd sat in as a child, and I made coffee, and I put Carl's folder on the table between us. I didn't say anything. I let her open it. She went through it slowly. She didn't cry right away. She got to the part about the woman in Scottsdale and she stopped, and her hand went flat on the table, and I watched her face do something I recognized. The same thing my face had done when I first read it. That moment when you understand that the version of your life you've been living wasn't the real one. Then she cried. I didn't try to fix it or rush it. I got up and refilled her coffee and sat back down and waited. That's the only thing you can do sometimes. After a long time, she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since February, most of it. Some things earlier." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I told her the truth. I said, "Because I needed you to be able to see it for yourself. If I told you before you were ready, you would have defended him, not because you are weak, but because you loved him, and I would have been asking you to choose before you had the evidence to make the choice clearly." She was quiet a long time. Then she said, "The basement, the workshop, what were they looking for?" I got up and took her back to the workshop. I showed her the false wall. I opened the lockbox. I took out the folder Grace had put together, the trust documents, the updated will, the list of everything and how it was structured, and I handed it to her. She went through it. I watched her face change as she realized how thoroughly everything was already protected, how long I'd been thinking about it, how none of what Todd had been looking for was ever where he thought it was. She said, "Mom's idea?" I said, "The wall was, the rest was mine." She closed the folder and held it in her lap for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Dad." And I could tell she meant it for several things at once. I said, "I know, and I meant that I understood all of them." The divorce took most of a year. Todd fought parts of it, which surprised me less than it surprised Claire. Grace handled the business and property questions, and there were no complications there because everything had been structured cleanly. The criminal case moved slower, the way those things do, and eventually settled into something less than I'd hoped, and more than nothing. The man from the bar. Carl eventually identified him. He had a history of what you might call creative real estate, properties that changed hands quickly under circumstances that, if you looked carefully, didn't quite add up. He was never charged in connection with my case. That bothers me some, but I've learned to make peace with the things I can't control and focus on the ones I can. Claire moved back to town. She's renting an apartment 12 minutes from the shop, a fact I pretend not to have calculated. She comes by on Thursdays now when Kevin closes up. She brings food, usually something better than what I would have made for myself, and we'd at the kitchen table, and sometimes she asked me to show her what I'm working on. Last Thursday, she picked up a movement I'd had on the bench for 2 days, a railroad pocket watch from the 1910s that had come in badly corroded, but mostly intact. She turned it over in her hands the way Margaret used to, carefully, with real attention. She said, "How do you even know where to start with something like this?" I said what I always say. You start with the piece that's most obviously wrong. You fix that. Then you look again. She set it down gently and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she looked up at me and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen in a long time. Not since before Todd. Maybe not since she was young. It was the look of someone deciding to pay attention. I picked up my loop and got back to work. And somewhere in the quiet of the shop, with the clocks ticking all around us, I felt something settle. Not quite back to where it was before because it never goes back exactly, but into something solid, something that would hold. There's a clock on my workbench right now that belonged to a railroad conductor who retired in 1923. It stopped working sometime in the 1970s and sat in a shoebox for 50 years before someone brought it to me. The mechanism wasn't broken beyond repair. It had just been neglected long enough that every small problem compounded into one big silence. I think about that clock when I think about what happened with my son-in-law. People like Todd don't appear fully formed. They develop the same way rust does, slowly, in the places you're not looking, in the gaps between what someone says and what they actually do. I noticed the gaps early. I chose to keep watching instead of reacting, and I've asked myself many times whether that was the right call. I think it was. Not because patience is always a virtue, but because some situations require you to understand the full shape of a problem before you start trying to fix it. Rush in too early and you fix the wrong thing. You break the trust of the person you're trying to protect before they're ready to be protected. What Todd never understood, what people like him rarely understand, is that integrity isn't just a moral position, it's a practical one. The choices I made over 40 years. The way I kept my books, the way I maintained the property, the way I treated my customers and my employees and my word, all of that created a foundation that he couldn't touch, no matter how much he wanted to. He was looking for a weakness that wasn't there, not because I'm extraordinary, because I'd been consistent. Consistency over time builds something that opportunists can't dismantle in a hurry, and they're almost always in a hurry. I've thought a lot about Claire in all of this. She made a mistake, a significant one. But I want to be honest with myself about what her mistake actually was. She didn't stop being a good person. She trusted someone who was skilled at being trusted. That's not a failure of character. It's a failure of information. Once she had the information, she made the right choice, and she made it without me telling her what to do. That mattered to me more than I can easily explain. What I hope she takes from this, what I'd want anyone to take from it, is that real strength isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the daily decisions that nobody's watching. The ones that don't seem to matter until suddenly, they're the only thing standing between you and someone who spent years looking for an opening. The discipline of doing things right when it's inconvenient, of knowing your own situation well enough that no one can surprise you with it, of staying steady when someone is counting on your grief to make you careless. That's what actually protects you. Kevin, my assistant, acted on instinct that night. He saw something wrong, and he called me instead of convincing himself it was nothing. I've never stopped being grateful for that. He was 19 years old, and he trusted his own judgment. That's not a small thing. Claire picked up that railroad pocket watch last Thursday and turned it over in her hands carefully, the way someone does when they're genuinely curious about how something works. That's where I think she's headed now. Toward curiosity. Toward attention. Toward building something she understands from the inside out, so that no one can ever tell her a story about it that isn't true. That's all any of us can really do. Know your own life well enough that no one else gets to define it for you.